Let's talk about something that I think affects pretty much all of us. We're diving into a really fascinating mystery in the workplace, this huge and honestly growing gap between the scientific research on work and the actual real-world problems that you and I face on the job every single day. You know, have you ever read one of those articles about the latest findings on team motivation or leadership and just thought to yourself, okay, that sounds nice, but it has literally nothing to do with my team or my company? Yeah, if you felt that, you are definitely not alone. It's a super common feeling, and it actually points to a very real, documented problem in the world of workplace psychology. So, to really get what's gone wrong, we need to look at how it was all supposed to work. The whole field of industrial organizational psychology, or IO psychology for short, was built on this really cool idea called the scientist-practitioner model. The concept is actually pretty simple. It's a two-way street. Scientists do rigorous research that helps practitioners, the managers, the HR leaders, the people in the trenches, solve real problems. And then the problems those practitioners are dealing with should spark new ideas for the scientists to study. See, it's supposed to be this perfect feedback loop, at least in theory.
But that beautiful theory, well, it's hitting a major reality check. A massive, and I mean massive study that spans almost half a century suggests this ideal relationship is actually breaking down. It's uncovered what they call a scientist-practitioner gap, basically a widening chasm between the world of academia and the real world of work. And that brings up a huge question. How on earth did we get here?
To figure that out, we're just going to follow the evidence. We're going to look at what this landmark study uncovered when researchers decided to go way back in time and conduct this epic 45-year review to see what's really been going on. And their method? It was exhaustive. They went through and analyzed every single article ever published in the two most prestigious journals in their entire field, the Journal of Applied Psychology and Personnel Psychology. These are the top tier, the absolute cream of the crop, where all the most important research is supposed to show up. And they didn't just skim a few years. They manually coded and analyzed every single one. That's 5,780 articles. This wasn't just some sample. It was a complete census of the field's published knowledge for over 4 decades. I mean, just think about the sheer scope of this. It starts all the way back in 1963 and runs through 2007. That's pretty much an entire professional career. In that time, we saw massive shifts in the economy, in technology, in the very nature of what work even means. The big question is, did the research actually keep up with any of it? So, what did this mountain of data actually show? Well, the investigation kicked off with a pretty simple question. What have researchers really been focusing on all these years? And what's wild is how consistent the answers were. Over the entire 45-year period, the most popular topics barely changed. The single biggest chunk, over a fifth of all research, was on methodology and psychometrics, which in plain English is basically research about how to do research. Statistics, survey design, measurement. Now that stuff is important for sure, but it's fundamentally a field talking to itself. The other big topics were things like motivation and performance measurement. Core ideas, yeah, but this intense focus on measurement and internal academic debates is our first major clue. And this leads us to the next really critical question. If the topics are so focused on academic methods, what does that tell us about the authors? Who exactly is getting published in these top journals? And here, right here, is maybe the most telling piece of evidence of all. This chart shows this steady and frankly alarming decline in the number of authors who come from outside of a university. The voice of the practitioner, the consultant, the person in government, the corporate leader, has been systematically fading away from the field's most important conversations. To put a really fine point on it, the data is just stark. By the early 2000s, the number of non-academic authors in the Journal of Applied Psychology had totally plummeted to less than 5%. The conversation had become almost exclusively an academic one. It was academics writing for other academics, a classic echo chamber. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. So what? Why does any of this matter? Well, the real-world consequences are huge. When research gets this disconnected from practice, what happens is that the research starts lagging further and further behind what's actually happening in the world of work. Just look at this comparison from the 1990s. On one side, you have researchers publishing tons of articles on statistics, psychometrics, and performance appraisals. And on the other side, what was happening in the real world? The explosion of e-commerce, the rise of remote work and contractors, a huge demand for work-life balance. The disconnect is just glaring. The world was changing fast, but the research priorities were stuck in place. Let's zoom in on a more recent example that perfectly captures this gap. It's this concept of talent management, a term that became a massive, massive priority for businesses in the 2000s. As The Economist pointed out back in 2006, this was a huge deal. Companies were desperate to figure out how to find, grow, and keep their best people, but they were totally struggling. This was basically a massive cry for help from the real world, a problem that desperately needed scientific insight.
And when you break down what talent management really is, its core pieces, recruitment, development, retention, these are exactly the kinds of things you'd expect IO psychology to be an expert in. This is supposed to be their bread and butter.
So how did the research world respond to this cry for help? Okay, prepare yourself for this number. During the 2000s, when talent management was one of the hottest topics in business, less than 1% of the articles in the Journal of Applied Psychology had anything to do with recruitment. A cornerstone of the biggest business trend of the decade was almost completely ignored by the field's top journal.
Now, it's easy to just point out a problem. What's way more valuable is figuring out a solution. And the authors of this study, thankfully, didn't just diagnose the issue. They proposed some really concrete ways to start rebuilding that bridge between the world of science and the world of practice.
And they laid out this 5-part strategy. The core ideas really boil down to 2 things: movement and incentives. First, you've got to get academics out into the business world and get practitioners onto university campuses so they can actually share knowledge. Then, you have to change the rules of the game. Universities need to start rewarding real-world impact, not just counting the number of publications an academic has. And finally, we need better ways for people to connect, and we need to train the next generation of researchers to think about practical solutions from day one. Ultimately, all of this comes back to purpose, right? As the management scholar William Starbuck so powerfully put it, the whole point of this kind of research isn't just to build a career or to get published. It's about contributing to human welfare, about making work better, more effective, and more fulfilling for all of us. And that really leaves us with one final, and I think really important question to think about. This isn't just a problem for IO psychology. This gap between theory and what's actually happening on the ground exists in almost every field. You see it in medicine, in education, in tech. So the question for all of us is, what concrete steps can we take to start building that bridge in our own fields to make sure that knowledge doesn't just serve itself, but that it actually serves all of us?